Anne and I are super excited to be here in conversation with each other.
Yes.
And yeah, so we were talking behind this backstage about how we both came from policy and advocacy and research, and yet we're here talking about storytelling, which is kind of fun and curious. But Anne, yeah, do you want to get us started with just talking about your own sort of evolution to the storytelling piece?
Yeah, I'm a traditional policy trained person and really thought about how I do this work as more about presenting facts and persuading people, using persuasive language. And when I think about my earlier days, because I started this work doing work on hunger and really poverty-related work, when we were doing storytelling, we'd find that this perfect person, impacted person, right, who we thought could really represent the issue. And what we didn't really realize is that oftentimes we didn't really have a narrative that we were really trying to push. And so oftentimes just having someone go up and speak was sometimes leaning into the most harmful narratives. And one really was about like deservedness and personal responsibility, like this is a good person and does the right thing. And so it's a little cringy when I think about it now, but it certainly has been an evolution in saying, I never studied this stuff before. I didn't know anything about narrative work until about 12 years, 13 years ago. So my journey has been one of really constant learning. What about you?
Yeah, for me, so I have done legal work and policy work and advocacy work for a long time, have worked on paid family and medical leave and paid sick days and equal pay and tried to pass policies at the federal and state levels, and realized at this moment in 2021, when the window closed on the first opportunity we'd had in a long time to pass national paid leave policy, that we needed to do something a little bit different with respect to the stories that people understood about themselves and the stories that they were seeing reflected on screen about gender, work, family, and care. And so that brought me to really look at how other organizations and other issues had used entertainment media to push new understandings for viewers about themselves and about the world around them and about context, and to disrupt this hero narrative around like we just have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Every family needs to figure out childcare, figure out paid leave, negotiate with their bosses, navigate gender roles in their own households. And instead, we needed stories that are on screen that reflect the way that people live and work. And so did a lot of research, learned a ton from organizations like Caring Across Generations, which you'll hear from later, National Domestic Workers and Color of Change and Define American, the LGBTQ rights movement that so beautifully used entertainment media as part of a strategy around marriage equality and rights, and started a project called Rescripting Gender, Work, Family, and Care, and commissioned some research showing what audiences themselves are dealing with in their own lives. We found that 55% of streaming viewers are facing work, family, and care conflicts. And 84% of viewers want to see their lives reflected on screens in this way. We've done some work around abortion storytelling and how to make those stories more holistic to include issues that people deal with when they're facing a pregnancy around childcare and paid leave and workplaces that are not particularly family-friendly. And also understood more of the kinds of stories that audiences want to see, which are aspirational, around people being more equitable in how they're dividing care in their households, moms who are often not seen on screen as breadwinners and caregivers being seen doing both, dads providing hands-on care, people speaking with pride rather than apology about their work-family experiences, and people looking for and finding solutions. And we found that close to 50 million streaming viewers want to see these stories. And so the project has really been focused on taking those stories out to people who make content.
That's amazing. It's amazing. It's good to think about some of the learnings along the way, right? And I think that, for me, I think about something that Mia Birdsong always says. She says, narratives eat policy for breakfast. And I think it's a powerful quote, but it's like really understanding that narratives is the driver. It's something I didn't understand before, that narrative is actually the driver. It really allows us to know what's possible, how we lean into shared values and ideas to really push a vision. And there's a lot. I mean, it's really buzzy, right? Everyone's doing narrative work. What is it? And people are doing it in so many different ways. But one thing that I've learned along the way is that we really don't know much, right? We're just learning. One of the earlier things in my work, I worked on the racial wealth gap, and this was about 12 years ago, and I realized like something about this isn't working. We're not really engaging people. Yes, we had media coverage. Yes, everyone's talking about the racial wealth gap, but there was no movement building behind it. And part of it, through the work working with a cognitive scientist, is like the narrative around a gap is not going to move people, right? And while it was branded, and I would tell people, hey, we've got to make some shifts, people said, this is a brand. We've already got it dialed in. And I felt like a lone wolf out there saying, like, no, we can't keep saying this, right? And still, to this day, a lot of people think it's just words. It's just words. But if we don't really understand how our audiences think and feel and act, not what we want them to, we wish they could, but how they actually do, that we're actually not making the movement we want to see in the world. And sometimes we're doing, harm. We don't realize that we're doing harm, but we lean into narratives that are very, very harmful. Just even as we talk about the economy as kind of this like thing that happens to us, and it's coming on down from high, and if we don't feed it, it's going to get grumpy and it's going to be mad at us, and like all of these things. If you really look and read like stories about the economy, it's almost like it's this entity out there that does stuff to us. Not that this is man-made, it's not natural. And so the learning for me has been, every time I've gone in and done a little bit of field testing with audiences, and it comes back and you're like, whoa, I never thought that that's how people actually think. And I'm talking about our base, y'all. I'm not just talking about some audience, because we're not trying to reach everybody. We're trying to reach very, very select audiences, but people that we think are with us, sometimes people of color, it's shocking that the way in which people are thinking is not what we thought it was going to be.
What's the best example that you can share about that?
I think the biggest, and it's such a dominant narrative, is really about it's really about your individual choices and behavior that decides your economic success. We know that's like a predominant American narrative, but it is so steeped. Mm-hmm. I remember doing some work in the Delta in Mississippi, and with a group of folks who were sitting around talking about wealth, and they were like, what is wrong with us, right? What is wrong with us? Why can't we do this? There's something wrong with us. And it broke my heart, because we're sitting there are no banks, there are no jobs, and it was shocking to see that blame, but also understanding that that's what people have been fed over and over again, and it's reinforced in so many ways, in communities, in churches, on TV, and we have to combat that, and it's a sticky narrative that's hard to push, hard to move.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that. I was actually just reflecting with a colleague last week on this very issue about sort of individualistic mindsets versus collective mindsets and structural mindsets, a lot of the work that the Frameworks Institute has done. And we were just reflecting, even at the Democratic National Convention, and probably at the Republican one too, but I don't know about that. But there were just, every story is about bootstraps and sort of self-made folks and how you got ahead in your own personal success story. And yeah, like there is individual initiative that people take that leads to their success, but there's so much else that determines what's possible or like what's available to you. And so we think a lot about that in the rescripting work, about how do you encourage Hollywood to tell character-driven, entertaining stories that also recognize the context in which people are living. And so, and how do you, and also for people, even the executives and the storytellers, the showrunners and writers who are telling these stories, who want to tell these stories, they too are coming from their own perspective. And so if I go in and say, so, just so they take the meeting because they're like, oh yeah, I had to figure out how to deal with childcare with my child, or I needed to take care of my spouse and also had this really demanding job and it was on me to figure this out. I don't need help telling this story because I've lived it. And so it takes one more beat to say, well, but also, yes, this was your experience, and it is reflective of, the half of families who live in childcare deserts, and everybody who is paying more in childcare than they do in rent, and the fact that most people don't have paid family leave when somebody in their family needs care, and you give them a couple of statistics and it opens their eyes to this whole other set of concerns. And then the question is, how do you infuse that into storytelling in a way that helps audiences feel seen and also understands that their experiences are shared by so many other people and that they have some agency and power to change their own story and the story of America in terms of like the policies that we have in place. So I'm curious sort of how that, your enterprise at Maven is a little bit new. I'm curious how you're doing things differently and sort of what you've learned in that journey.
Yeah, I think at Maven, and we're only 18 months old, we're babies, is one, taking what we've done for so many years and bringing that together in a lot of ways. One, we've done some work in terms of narrative change on guaranteed income. And I really see that issue, even though some folks are not working on the issue. And this is a thing I think is really important because we are siloed and we know that, there's work being done on care and we might not be working in that sphere. But all that it can teach us is so important. And for me, guaranteed income, what it can teach us, not just about big policies like child tax credits, but like about deservedness, personal responsibility, and hard work. And those are so foundational. I don't care if you're working on health, I don't care if you're working on housing. All of those are so foundational in our work. What we can learn from people who are trying to push in those arenas can be so instructive to us, right? So, hard work is a narrative you cannot get around. I'm like, can't we just not say that? And he's like, no, you can't not just say it. Because people have a very, very much of attachment to it, but there are ways we can think about hard work differently, not just what you do on a paid job, but how you contribute to community. And how can we push that a little bit more? So those are things that we're trying to play with at Maven. And I would just secondly say that it's our qualitative work. So we've been talking about policy and research, right? That we're really trying to understand narrative change in that context. If you go on our website, you'll see it's so dreamy. I love it though. We're dreamers, but all of that is to really say, how do we conduct qualitative research that can unearth new narratives, counter narratives that we can test in the field? And how do we go about doing that? And part of it for us is storytelling and qual work can be so extractive. You're really going and saying, tell me about the most painful parts of your life, right? Tell me about your struggles. What if we really think about this as more of a dreaming, visioning body of work, that there's joy, that there's healing in the qual methodological approach? What do we learn from that? And how do we have much more of a community experience, not just one where we're just taking, right? And so for us, what we're really seeing with that approach is that, particularly because we've been working with Black women, they already got counter narratives. They're already there, right? They already have expansive views that really are not just about their families, but about our nation writ large. So how can we then take what we're learning from that and take it out to the field and test it more with other audiences to see if we can bridge some of those wedges?
That's really cool.
Yeah. What about you? I mean, I want to just hear from you because, when we were first connected again, and you're like, we're doing this work in Hollywood, I'm like, whoa, that seems a little intimidating. So tell us a little bit about how did you get there? How did you choose this? How do you kind of do it?
Yeah.
And what are you learning?
Yeah, well, it's been very experimental. As I said, there are groups that have been doing this work for 20 years. What's interesting is the industry is changing a lot right now. DEIA is contracting there like it is everywhere else. There were strikes that kind of came right as we were ramping up our engagement with storytellers and executives and the WGA and the DGA. And so it's been a real learning process. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how the relationship between who is telling stories and what stories are being told. So for folks who don't follow, but you probably know this, there were huge unprecedented strikes in Hollywood last year that were really about whether people who are not independently wealthy and not super privileged are able to exist in this industry. So that's Black and brown people and women in particular, and queer folks and disabled folks. And the relationship between their ability to be in the industry and telling stories and making films and making television shows opens doors to kinds of stories that we want told around gender, work, family, and care. So we've been doing a lot of work on pipeline, getting new and sort of emerging storytellers up to speed on how their own lived experiences are reflected in broader society. We've been making a lot of materials, so tip sheets that are all on our website, which is newamerica.org/entertainment, tip sheets around how do you write about parents without reinforcing stereotypes? How do you write about abortion and pregnancy storytelling in context? I just did an event with the Writers Guild Foundation and some folks at Abortion on Screen last week. I made a tip sheet that was about civic engagement and work family. So there's a huge focus in Hollywood right now on democracy and civic engagement stories. Well, there are amazing examples out there of real life people who have gotten involved in their communities because of childcare or because of paid leave or because of living wage. And so figuring out really digestible ways to bring those stories, those examples to storytellers, letting them know that there are paid sick days and paid leave laws all across the country because of many people in this room. And letting them know how they can integrate those kinds of laws into the stories that they're telling. So if they're telling a story in California or telling a story in Massachusetts, here's this one thing you can stick in. And then what's really cool about that is if it happens, that's great. If it doesn't happen, we still can use social media to then push out narratives about what's actually on the ground. So one example, there's a show that was on called Station 19 that took place in Seattle. There were two characters on that show that were having a baby. They didn't acknowledge the paid leave law in Washington or really grapple with a parent taking leave, except to say, I wish you could take leave, and I want to make sure that you can take leave, but I need to find coverage. Well, we were able to actually tap into the movement to save Station 19. There was a hashtag, like it was big, they had billboards up in Times Square, and did a couple social media posts that celebrated the fact that these parents were now new parents on the show, but also pivoted to Washington State's paid leave website and talked about the laws that exist in Washington State. And so that was kind of and we ended up with 20,000 organic views on that post just because we were able to tap into the zeitgeist. So I use that as an example of just like the experimentation that we've had to figure out what works and what doesn't. I've been able to brief executives at Disney and CBS and NBC, have been able to talk to writers who are in writers' rooms now, as well as those who are telling stories in the future. And it's as you said, I'll just end with sort of, it's a long road. Narrative change is not quick. Entertainment-based narrative change is not quick because of how long it takes to get stories told and how long it takes to get things produced. But I do believe, in the end, you can have 100 million people seeing a show over time. And those narratives, especially when there are characters that people have parasocial interaction with or have a feeling of affinity for, like they're their friends, can really start to shape the way that people see themselves in the world.
Yeah, that's really amazing. That's an amazing journey and really a huge accomplishment. I know we're running up against time, so we're gonna let's think about a couple of things we want to leave the audience with. So I want to piggyback on a couple of things that you said. I think that for me, experimentation and testing and refining is everything. And I certainly push on funders to say, give us a space to experiment. Give us a space to just try this out. This is a long race. This is over the horizon work, but it's the work for the rest of our lives. Like, we're never going to stop doing this work, right? But we've got to really understand where there are opportunities for us to really make more progress and see these policies put into place and to see much more permanent shifts, right? Not just that one win that can be just overridden with the stroke of a pen. We've seen that time and time again. How do we make our narrative sticky? So experimenting and testing, I would say. For me, I would say that, surfacing that lived experience is so critical, and we're all in different spaces. So whether that is working with people on the ground because you are doing grassroots work, or whether you're actually just like us that does a lot of advocacy, but more policy and research, that we all have a play in this ecosystem, right? And so, you know, we have to get creative, push against the norms, and know that there's going to be a lot of testing and refining along the way.
Yeah, I love that. I think that makes a ton of sense. And I would just add, like, narrative change is a group endeavor. And
Yes.
you mentioned ecosystem. I think there is no way that any one group or any one movement really can use narratives in a way that shifts culture and policy alone. And all of the work that we do is iterative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your point about lived experience is so critical. And I really want to find ways to bring more lived experience into writers' rooms and into the consciousness of folks who are telling stories that tens and hundreds of millions of people see and that shape the way that we understand ourselves and our country and also our role within making change there. So,
well, thank you.
thank you.
You just closed us out. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.